on to the next step, which is the head and grips. But first, let's build the mixer arm. So it's pretty straightforward. Get out the 4-shouldered bearings, same kind we used on the washout, same size, and go ahead and get those into the mixer arms. Actually, I'm having a little problem getting that one in straight. Anyway, go ahead and get those in, and then the next thing we want to do is put the balls on. Now, it's pretty straightforward. On this end is a hole. You just put a ball straight in there. Drop a CA, ball. Recommend the CA on this stuff. The next one is you'll see 2 holes. The manual's recommending the inner hole, okay, not the outer hole. So we're going to put a ball in there. Actually, so you realize, see this standoff area sticking out? The ball goes in on this side. So we're going to use the inner hole on this side. The ball's going to go in this way. Okay, let's not mess that up. Ball in this way. Here's your standoff area. That's the way it's going to go. All right, so get them in straight. Let's come back and review. Okay, there we go. Mixer arms made. Again, note the orientation. This standoff area, the ball's on the opposite side. So make sure you get that right or it's not going to work right. All right, so the next point is we're going to go ahead and put in a 2 by 10 millimeter screw, and we're going to screw these onto the blade grips. Again, I'm going to use a drop of CA down inside the hole. Don't make a mess of it. Don't get it in your bearings. Seriously, just a drop inside, clean it off. Go ahead and screw those on. Let's come back and review. Okay, there we go. Mixer arms on. Again, note the orientation. This ball faces toward the spindle or the head. Okay, this ball out. Pretty basic. Make sure this spins free, okay? It should spin really free. Check both of them. Don't over tighten these screws. You're into plastic. And by the way, the CA absolutely is, I would highly recommend, okay? Make sure you don't get it in your bearings. Make sure everything's free. All right, let's continue on from here. Okay, on to assembling the blade grips. So go ahead and get out 2 of the larger out of the bag, larger regular bearings, okay? And they're going to go on the inside of the grip. Now, something I noticed is one of my grips had a little bit of plastic flashing at the mold release point. So go ahead and clean that stuff off. Make sure you haven't got any flashing. It might interfere with dampeners or the head. Anyway, basically go ahead and get those bearings pressed in. Now what you can do is start to feed it. Use a tool and just kind of push it in. All right, make sure it's seated on both. All right, get those in. We'll come back and talk about the thrust bearings. Okay, so we got the bearings in the grips, and what we're going to do now is do the thrust bearings. So it's important to note how the thrust bearings go. Now, in the manual, it actually points out that when you're building the thrust bearings, it's saying there's an outside O and an inside I. Now, check this out. This is pretty cool. On each thrust bearing, if you look at the flat side, not the side with the groove in it, the flat side, you'll see there's actually a letter. I'm not sure you can see that. That's an I. Okay, so I've made this an I, and this is an O. All right. Now, one way to tell for sure is the outside one, or O, will be tight on the spindle, and the inside I will be very loose on the spindle. It's important we get that right. It's also important we get the ball bearing race in right. So what I like to do is I'm going to take a tool, load the bearings on there, and then we'll feed that into the grips. So the first thing we want to do is put the O outside with the groove facing up onto a tool. All right? Then what we want to do is take the ball race. Now there's no grease on this, so we need to grease it. I'm going to go ahead and use some grease I have. And we're going to fill, notice on the ball bearing, there's an open cup face and a face that just shows balls. We need to pack this with grease. Additionally, this needs to face in, this open face needs to face in on the grease so centrifugal force doesn't throw the grease out. If we put it this way, since it's open, the grease will just get thrown out all over your blade. So we want to put it that way. So we're going to pack this with grease. So we've got the outside on with the groove up. Then we're going to put this with the opening of the ball races. Then we're going to take an inside. Let's make sure it's an inside. Okay, and we're going to put the groove of the inside toward the ball race. So get it? Groove toward the ball race, groove toward the ball race. We got the outside, we got the inside. And then what we'll do is we'll just use a tool and feed that into the grips. Okay, so make sure you grease up that ball race with some grease and do both grips the same way. And let's get the thrust bearings in the grips. We'll come back and review. Okay, so we got the thrust bearings in. Now, one thing is make sure the thrust bearing is not cocked. the inner race went in rather tight in the grip, whereas the outer race dropped right in. So on one of mine, I had to pull the ball bearing and the outer race out and just kind of press and seat that inner race, the one that's in that went in first, down. Okay, make sure you're not cocked, or it's going to cause a problem later. All right, then the instructions say to get out 2.01 spacers. Well, in my kit, in a Ziploc bag, I only had 2 spacers. However, what I did was I figured, okay, maybe something's changed. They said 201s. I only have 2. So I went ahead and got my calipers and calipered this, and it happens to be 02. Okay, perfect. Well, what they've done is they've eliminated the need for 2 spacers and made a thicker spacer at 02. No big deal. We want to make sure that that goes down into our grip before the radial bearing. Make sure, now what you might want to do at this point is use the spindle, okay, and make sure the spacer lines up with the hole, because the spacer does not fit the grip to where, you know, you can be off center. You don't want to damage it trying to get this bearing in and seated. So you can put the spindle screw on, or just, you know, the bearing I notice fits pretty good. Make sure the bearing's seated at this point. Okay, pull the spindle out the back. All right, and make sure your spacer doesn't move. Okay, my spacer actually moved. I don't have that bearing down all the way. Okay, bear with. Okay. Yep, I didn't. The spindle, a screw on the spindle and pulling the spindle will seat that. Now my bearing's seated all the way in the grip. My spacer hole, because if the spacer's offset slightly and you try and jam this grip on, you could damage the spacer with the spindle trying to come through when we put it on the head. All right, so make sure that spacer's lined up and the bearing's all the way seated. Do the same thing the other grip, spacer, bearing. Let's come back, complete the head. Okay, by the way, I want to point out, only because I found one of my grips, the bearings weren't seated all the way. When the bearing's seated, you should have about a 2 or 3 millimeter. Let's see if I can show that. You should have the bearing beyond this plastic right here. Looks like about, 1 second, let me measure it. Looks like about 7-8 millimeters of plastic sticking out from the bearing into the grip. Make sure all that stuff's seated, because when we go to tighten up the spindle and it gets notchy, it could be because something's happened here and you haven't got all this stuff seated. So make sure that your bearing is in about that far. Hope that looks good and makes sense. Let's continue on. Okay, next up is to assemble the blade grips onto the head of the helicopter. So we need to get out the 6 O-rings or dampeners, 2 of the, bear with me here, make sure we get them right, 2 3x8 millimeter screws, 2 washers, and then these 2 spacers. Now, please pay attention to these spacers. The spacer has a shoulder on one side and is flat on the other side. We got to make sure those go right. So here's the way I like to do this. Go ahead and put a washer on a screw, apply a little Loctite, okay, and we want to work a little fast. It takes a few minutes for this stuff to go off. We're going to put the screw on one end of the spindle or feathering shaft, all right, and tighten it as best we can by hand. All right, we're going to feed that into one of the grips, okay. Okay, at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to take one of these spacers and with the shoulder toward the bearing. It's important you get that right. That shoulder rides on that bearing. Okay, so that we got that, again, the shoulder toward the bearing, flat side of the spacer toward the head. All right, the next thing we want to do is load the head up. Let's get the head out. Load the head up with these rubbers. Now, it doesn't say to use any grease or anything on here, so I'm not going to, but let's load 3 of those rubbers into the head. And then, now, here's what's important. Note the orientation when you feed this grip through the spacers. All right, that gets us our one side. Leading edge of the paddle, blade grip control arm toward the paddle with the leading edge. Do not get it flipped this way so that the mixer arm is toward this trailing edge, okay? So it's leading edge control on this. Head turns this way. Note the paddles. Head turns this way. The grip should be on this side. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to take the other O-rings, okay? We're going to load those in this side of the head. Okay, at this point, just work them down in the head around the spindle. Okay, I did not have to grease. They went in just fine. Okay, doesn't say to use grease, so get them seated. Okay, at this point, go ahead and let's put the spacer on with the shoulder again facing the grip onto the spindle. So let's get that spacer on there, and then we'll come back and put the other grip on. Okay, so there we go. We got the spacer on. Now, don't be surprised if this rubber O-ring on this side of the grip keeps popping out on you. But again, the spacer's on with that shoulder toward the grip. Now we take our last grip. Again, note the orientation. Put it on. Okay, put it on the spindle. And then take our last screw, put some Loctite on it. Okay, and we're going to need 2 Allen wrenches for this job. Let me get the Loctite on there. Again, put it on. Wipe it in the threads. Don't make a mess. You don't want to foul your thrust bearings and everything. Okay, now you're going to need 2 Allen wrenches. And for sure, you want to make sure this thing is tight. So we need an Allen wrench in one end. Do not try and do this without 2 Allen wrenches. If you don't have them, go get them. This will be a problem if you don't have this spindle tight. You could throw an entire grip. Seen it happen. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and tighten up. Alright, both spindle screws are tight. Now, what you want to do at this point is, again, note the orientation, leading edge paddle, leading edge blade grip. Okay, head rotates this way, should be leading control. Now, check both grips. Now, what you'll find is this whole assembly can slide in those dampeners. If one grip is too tight, just simply take your Allen wrench and go with the direction of tightening and slightly push on it and until both grips feel about the same tightness. Now, don't expect them to spin totally free. There we go. A little bit more. Okay. Get those rubber seated. Alright. Don't expect them to spin totally free, but they shouldn't be like steppy notchy, okay? But they're not like at all completely smooth, okay? I mean, they're somewhat, but because the dampening that we want in the head, the dampening is going to tighten up on those thrust bearings. All right, so you don't want them notchy, but they should not, you know, they won't spin totally free, but they should feel a little tight. Anyway, that finishes that part of the head. Let's continue on. Okay, last but not least, out of bag D, at least for this portion of the head build, is to get the head on the main shaft. Now, last bolt in here that's an all thread will be our Jesus bolt for the head. The remaining 2 bolts that are shouldered bolts are blade grips and the nylock nuts and links. We'll go into that later in what I'm going to do as a separate step of part of bag D, which is head setup and getting the links right. But let's go ahead and get the head bolt on. So basically, if you look, one side is recessed and not threaded, and one side is got threads. There is no nut on this. So go ahead, let's put the head on. And it doesn't matter which way you line up the head bolt, but go ahead and we'll line up the washout too. Let me get that straight up. Line up the washout onto the pins. You know, you don't have to do that quite yet now. If your servos are all down, go ahead and get those lined up. I would. And then go ahead and line up the head bolt. Put the bolt in on the side that is shouldered without threads. You're going to need Loctite on this. There's no nylock. Go ahead and get the head bolt on. Go ahead and do that. We'll come back, finish that up to make sure, and continue on. Okay, that's it. Go ahead and get that bolt in and tighten it up good. Now, it is into aluminum, so you don't want to like over tighten it, but you want to tighten it enough that it pulls the split in the head right here together and tightens the head up on the main block so it doesn't waddle. There's no nut on the other side, but just make sure it's tightened up really well, and don't forget the Loctite. Okay, that finishes bag D of the head build. Again, the rest of bag D I'll go into head setup and linkage setup, which we're going to use the radio for, and at that point that'll be finish bag D.